I have watched empires destroy themselves before. It begins with fatal arrogance, assuming strength substitutes for strategy, that loyal neighbors remain loyal regardless of treatment. February 14th, 2025. Donald Trump announces sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods. 25% on lumber, steel, and agricultural products, 15% on energy. Then comes the insult that crosses every psychological boundary. Canadian aluminum and steel are classified as threats to American national security under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act. Most Americans saw this as standard political theater, tough talk to satisfy domestic constituencies, a negotiating position that would bring Canada to heel, as it always had, trade policy as usual. They misread the moment entirely. This is where history pivots, not in dramatic declarations, but in the quiet mathematics of changed incentives. In the moment when subordination becomes voluntary. The Roman Republic made identical calculations, treating Italian allies as expendable resources. Those allies built new power structures, found new patrons. When Rome needed them during social wars, relationships had fundamentally shifted. The economic data tells a story Americans refuse to acknowledge. Canadian travel collapsed 37% in March. Cross-border shopping stopped. Individual decisions became national economic strategy. This was not organized by Ottawa. This was grassroots economic warfare driven by wounded national pride. The effect on American border communities was immediate and devastating. Shopping malls in Bellingham saw foot traffic drop 60%. Hotels in Montana and North Dakota matched 2008 crisis levels, $4.2 billion in lost revenue within 6 months. But real miscalculation occurred in energy infrastructure. Canada supplies 4.3 million barrels daily to the United States. Heavy crude designed for American refineries that cannot switch to domestic shale without massive retooling costs. When Trump imposed a 15% tariff on Canadian energy, expecting Ottawa to absorb the cost, he triggered what economists now recognize as a perfect example of supply chain weaponization. American refineries saw their input costs spike by $18 per barrel overnight. They passed this cost directly to American consumers. By summer 2025, drivers in Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, and Wisconsin were paying an additional 41 cents per gallon solely due to the Canadian energy tariff. Republican governors in these states publicly broke with the administration. The American Trucking Association called the tariffs economically suicidal. The political narrative had already shifted beyond Washington's control. While American officials doubled down, something unprecedented happened in Ottawa. Mark Carney assumed leadership following Trudeau's resignation. Not another career politician, but a figure who guided Canada through 2008 crisis as bank governor, then became first non-British governor of Bank of England. Carney understood leverage better than anyone in Washington. His response was strategic patience. Let opponents exhaust themselves while quietly building infrastructure for complete economic separation. The centerpiece, $1.2 trillion sovereignty investment program in budget 2025. Strategic capital expenditure to restructure the Canadian economy for permanent independence from American market access, $340 billion for east-west trade corridors, $280 billion for critical minerals processing, $180 billion for Arctic Gateway Initiative at Churchill. Churchill had been dismissed as quaint northern outpost. Carney understood what American strategists missed. Churchill is the only deepwater Arctic port in North America directly connected to continental rail. The geometry is undeniable. A cargo ship traveling from Hamburg to Winnipeg saves 6,400 kilometers by using Churchill rather than traditional routes through the St. Lawrence or American ports. 12 days of transit time, approximately $620,000 in fuel costs per voyage saved. In an industry where margins are measured in pennies per ton, this represents revolutionary competitive advantage. The Hudson Bay Railway was transformed from regional freight line to strategic national asset. $67 billion in fast-tracked upgrades, thermal siphons, automated switching, grain terminals for 100,000-ton vessels. September 2025. First post-Panamax container ship docked in Churchill with Canadian wheat for Germany. Canada serving notice that North American trade no longer required American-controlled choke points. The market responded immediately. Canadian wheat futures jumped 23% as European buyers recognized they could source directly without American intermediaries. Potash prices, where Canada controls nearly half of global reserves, spiked 31%. But Carney's strategy extended far beyond infrastructure. He understood that true sovereignty required diplomatic diversification. While Trump was alienating traditional allies, Canada was quietly building a coalition of the willing. The comprehensive trade agreement with the European Union's defense program, worth $244 billion, integrating Canadian companies into European military supply chains. This wasn't commerce. This was a signal that if the United States retreated from NATO, Canada had alternative security relationships. The Asia-Pacific strategy was equally sophisticated. bilateral trade deals with Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand, targeting the 700 million person ASEAN market with combined GDP exceeding $4.8 trillion. Even the relationship with China was recalibrated with surgical precision. November 2025. Carney met with President Xi in what both leaders described as a strategic reset. Without endorsing China's political system, Canada positioned itself as a pragmatic middle power, willing to trade with all sides while serving as proxy for none. This neutrality allowed Canadian companies to maintain access to both American and Chinese markets, while their American competitors were forced to choose. The results speak for themselves. By the end of 2025, Canadian exports to the European Union were up 34% year over year. Exports to Asia increased by 28%. Meanwhile, American agricultural exports were declining as international buyers found alternative suppliers who did not subject them to political uncertainty. The most telling indicator, foreign investment in Canadian logistics and infrastructure jumped by 340% in the final quarter of 2025. Global capital was voting with its money, betting that Canada, not the United States, represented stability and growth in North America. This capital flight revealed the psychological impact of weaponizing trade relationships with stable democracies. International investors began questioning whether any American trade relationship was secure. The human cost reveals itself in American communities. Midwest towns like Youngstown and Flint face new closures as manufacturers struggle with Canadian input costs. 3 automotive parts manufacturers closed, citing 25% steel tariffs. 4,700 jobs lost in already devastated communities. Ironically, some factories are being courted by Canadian investors who want to relocate north of the border. The jobs aren't disappearing, they're moving to Canada. Meanwhile, Canadian farmers experience unprecedented prosperity. With direct Churchill access and freedom from American bottlenecks, Canadian wheat commands premium prices. Saskatchewan farmers saw 34% income increases. This agricultural shift has profound implications for global food security. Canada now controls not just production, but the logistics chain moving grain to world markets. In a world where food security equals national security, Canada has quietly become indispensable. Energy transformation has been equally dramatic. Canadian companies, once price takers forced to accept American refinery terms, accelerated export infrastructure investments. Trans Mountain expansion finished 8 months early. New terminals at Prince Rupert and Churchill created alternative routes to global markets. Western Canadian Select now trades within $3 per barrel of Brent prices, compared to the historical $18 discount. This price convergence represents billions in additional revenue flowing to Canadian producers, rather than American refiners. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith captured the moment. For too long, we were price takers with one customer. Today, we're price makers with options. That's sovereignty. The ripple effects extend far beyond North America. Mexico, observing Canada's strategy, has quietly coordinated its own diversification efforts. President Claudia Sheinbaum met with Carney in December 2025, establishing what both leaders described as a North American alternative framework. This Mexico-Canada partnership is built on a simple recognition. If they stand together during USMCA renegotiation, the United States cannot afford to lose both relationships simultaneously. Mexican manufacturers began sourcing Canadian raw materials. Canadian companies established assembly operations in Mexico for Asian market access. The two countries that America had taken for granted as captive markets were building their own bilateral trade relationship, independent of American involvement. European leaders watched with intense interest. Canada's successful resistance provided a roadmap other middle powers could follow. French President Macron and German Chancellor Scholz both visited Ottawa in late 2025, signing comprehensive partnerships covering critical minerals, renewable energy, and Arctic shipping. These weren't just commercial arrangements, they were strategic partnerships designed to reduce dependence on American-dominated supply chains. The most sophisticated element of Canada's strategy involved timing these announcements to maximize psychological impact on American negotiators. Each new partnership was revealed precisely when American business delegations were arriving in Ottawa, desperately seeking to repair damaged relationships. American corporate executives found themselves competing not just with each other for Canadian resources, but with well-financed European and Asian alternatives who offered more favorable terms and didn't carry the political risk of sudden policy reversals. The desperation became visible in corporate boardrooms. CEOs who had initially supported Trump's trade stance quietly began lobbying for reversals. Internal corporate memos revealed that Canadian restrictions added millions in costs per aircraft, forcing companies to consider relocating production outside the United States. But the damage extended beyond individual companies to entire industrial ecosystems. American manufacturing had been built on the assumption of reliable, low-cost Canadian inputs. Automotive supply chains designed over decades couldn't be rebuilt overnight. Steel mills that had specialized in processing Canadian ore couldn't simply switch to alternative sources without massive capital investment. The timing of all these economic maneuvers was building toward a single date, July 1st, 2026, the mandatory review of USMCA, where all three countries must decide whether to renew the agreement for another 16 years. Trump had viewed this date as a weapon, assuming that 18 months of tariffs and pressure would bring Canada and Mexico crawling to the table, desperate for a deal at any cost. Instead, as the review date approaches, according to early indicators from trade policy circles, the panic appears to be concentrated not in Ottawa, but in Washington. The December 2025 U.S. Trade Representative hearings were supposed to rubber stamp Trump's tough stance. Instead, they became a corporate revolt. Over 3 days, 147 American business leaders testified, begging the administration not to destroy trade relationships. The American Apple Association warned that losing Canadian market access would bankrupt thousands of farms. The Automotive Policy Council demonstrated that single car parts crossed the border 7 times during production. Taxing each crossing at 25% would add on average $400 to American-made vehicles. Ford cited supply chain disruptions for $1.4 billion in losses. GM closed 2 Michigan plants due to expensive Canadian components. Lawrence Summers drew historical parallels to the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, which triggered global trade war and deepened the Great Depression. When sophisticated economies refuse subordinate status, Summers wrote, they build entirely new networks. The Canadian steel mill that spent months certifying for German automotive companies won't abandon that relationship because Washington changes its mind. This insight reveals why Trump's strategy has backfired so completely. Leverage in international relations isn't determined by the size of your economy. It's determined by alternatives. For 80 years, the United States maintained dominance over Canada by ensuring that Canada had no choice but to sell to American markets and buy American goods. That monopoly is now broken. Canada has built alternative supply chains, alternative customers, and alternative infrastructure. Mark Carney can walk into the USMCA review with a folder full of signed trade deals and a unified country behind him. He can look across the table and say, we want free trade and partnership, but we don't need to be subjects. The United States, meanwhile, faces a $1.6 trillion hole in its economy if USMCA collapses. Half of that trade involves intermediate goods that fuel American manufacturing. Unlike Canada, the United States hasn't spent the last 18 months building alternative relationships. They've spent that time alienating existing partners. What we're witnessing isn't just a trade dispute. It's a historical correction that has been decades in the making. For too long, Canada accepted the role of resource colony, shipping raw materials south and buying back-finished goods at premium prices. The infrastructure being built today is permanent. The trade relationships being forged are sticky. Even if a future American administration offers to return to the old arrangement, the diversification won't simply reverse itself. Trust has been broken. In international relations, trust is the most valuable currency. When you treat a partner like an enemy, when you weaponize economic relationships for political theater, you don't get to simply reset when it becomes convenient. What we're seeing is the emergence of a new kind of superpower. Not a superpower of aircraft carriers and nuclear weapons, but a superpower of geography, resources, and strategic positioning. Canada controls the world's longest coastline, 20% of global freshwater, and the keys to Arctic passages that will define 21st century trade routes. The warming Arctic has transformed Canada's northern coast from frozen barrier into highway. The Northwest Passage now offers shipping routes that cut thousands of kilometers off journeys between Europe and Asia. Unlike the Suez Canal or Panama Canal, which can be blocked by hostile powers, the Northwest Passage runs through Canadian territorial waters. The irony is profound. In attempting to make America great again by reducing dependence on foreign nations, Trump has actually increased American vulnerability by creating a more independent Canada. The quiet neighbor to the north, which had been content to remain in America's economic orbit, has been pushed into building its own gravitational field. Countries controlling critical resources with multiple market options hold enormous leverage. Canada now employs this strategy across multiple sectors: energy, minerals, agriculture, freshwater. This diversification terrifies American planners, according to early indicators from Defense Department sources. Internal Pentagon memos leaked in January 2026 reveal deep concern about resource weaponization by allies, specifically citing Canada's ability to leverage critical mineral exports for political concessions. The irony is palpable. The United States, which weaponized economic relationships for decades, now finds itself vulnerable to identical tactics from its former junior partner. The psychological transformation within Canada has been equally remarkable. For generations, Canadian political discourse was shaped by concerns about American dominance, about being overwhelmed by their southern neighbors' economic and cultural influence. Trump's tariffs provided the external pressure needed to unify Canadian opinion around economic sovereignty. Polling data from late 2025 shows extraordinary consensus across Canada. 83% support building alternative trade relationships. This provided Carney with political capital. American negotiators failed to anticipate. Canadian universities report surging enrollment in Arctic studies and resource economics. Young Canadians increasingly view their country not as America's junior partner, but as a unique civilization with its own destiny. Canadian technology companies began developing Arctic solutions with global applications. Canadian Arctic expertise, long viewed as marginal, became strategically valuable as climate change opened new routes. The emergence of what analysts call Arctic Canada as a distinct economic and strategic entity represents perhaps the most significant geopolitical development in North America since the American Civil War. A region previously considered peripheral to global affairs has become central to 21st century trade routes and resource competition. Russian attempts to claim Arctic dominance have been quietly countered by Canadian infrastructure development and strategic partnerships with Nordic countries. China's Arctic ambitions face the reality that the most valuable Arctic passages run through Canadian territorial waters. The United States finds itself facing a competitor created through its own miscalculations. Every pressure tactic designed to force compliance accelerated Canadian independence. Every market access threat motivated Canada to build alternatives. In this environment, geography and resources matter more than military power or population size. Canada's vast territory, abundant resources, and strategic location provide advantages that cannot be easily replicated or defeated through conventional measures. The fatal American mistake wasn't just imposing tariffs. It was assuming that Canada would never call their bluff. That assumption has created not just an independent neighbor, but a strategic rival with all the resources needed for sustained competition. Mexican coordination with Canadian strategy adds another dimension to American vulnerability. The two countries America had taken for granted as economic dependencies have become partners in reducing their reliance on American markets and American policy stability. As July 1st, 2026 approaches, draft assessments from trade policy circles suggest that American negotiators will face something unprecedented in their experience: neighbors who have genuine alternatives to American economic relationships. For the first time since the early 19th century, the United States must negotiate with its neighbors as equals rather than dependents. The colonial economic model that defined North American relationships for 2 centuries has been permanently broken. This transformation occurred not through military conflict, but through quiet mathematics of changed incentives and patient planning. Canada demonstrated that middle powers with smart strategy and abundant resources can reshape continental balances without firing a shot. The most remarkable aspect is how quietly this fundamental shift occurred. While American media focused on political drama and campaign rallies, Canada was signing trade deals, building infrastructure, and constructing the foundation of genuine economic sovereignty. History does not punish intentions, it only records outcomes. The outcome here is clear. America's attempt to pressure its closest neighbor into submission has created the most independent Canada in modern history, armed with all the resources and relationships needed to compete as an equal.